The physics simulation tool lets us simulate dropping objects on top of another object and is a very quick way to assemble things like rubble or leaves, etc. throughout your scene, especially if you need to avoid intersections. To activate this, the first thing you need to do is install the tools. On the shelf above the scene view, we need to add the new shelf. So this used to be called the Game Dev Tools or the Game Development Toolset, but it's now called Side Effects Labs. So let's add this. And we need to update the tool shelf. So let me just press this and press update. Now we need to restart Houdini to access the new tools that will appear in this shelf. So now if we look in the shelf, we have these new tools. Now this doesn't just add some new tools to the shelf, but it also adds some nodes that we can play with. And this is where we find the physics simulation tool. So drop down a geo node and jump inside. And now drop down the physics painter. Nice. So we need to create a couple of things for this to work. The first thing we need is some base geometry to scatter on, which would otherwise be our landscape. So I'll quickly make a grid. And add some noise. And use this as our static object. So just plug this in. If we switch to Physics Painter, you'll see we are also giving this ground node, but we can remove this. If we go to the DOPS and settings, we can disable ground plane. And you'll see some options here. Now I could explain them, but it's much easier just to show you what they do. So we need some geometry to scatter. I'll just use a sphere and add some noise. I'll set this to, let me set this to polygon and set the frequency to something like 7. And drop down a mountain sop. This is fine. Now what we would then do after this is we would poly reduce this, and that's because the way Physics Painter works is it can use the low poly geometry as the simulation object and then replace this afterwards with the high poly geometry. So in practice this is what we would do, or we would just import a low poly object that we had made somewhere else. Nice. So in the Physics Painter, we just need to set our object to point towards the objects we want to scatter. So let me click on Dynamic and find the Poly Reduce here. And now if I press Enter in the viewport to bring up our paintbrush, I can start to paint this onto the geometry. Now it's a little big, so let me just change the scale here. That's better. Now to simulate this, all we need to do is press play in the timeline or just hold in the right arrow key. Nice. If we want to set this, we just need to press dry current paint, and then we can go ahead and paint some more on top. We have some falling through, but that's fine. We can adjust those settings later. We can also clear the current paint, activate all the paint, which would resimulate everything that we have done, or clear all the paint. We also have the opportunity to randomize the scale and the rotation. So we can reduce the min scale and or increase the max scale. And we can set this to max of 360. And now when we paint, we get these randomizations. Nice. Now, on the output, we have the option of exporting everything that we have or exporting just the paint objects. Now, if we then choose to use a render mesh and point this towards, say, the Mountain 2 node, where we have the high poly geometry, if we take a look at what this output is, you'll see we now have the high poly geometry here. Now we do have some other options like stroke padding, surface offset, but as I mentioned before, these options are pretty self-explanatory, so there's no point of really going into too much detail on these. Now, the paint bucket mode is very cool. We can very quickly flood the whole scene if we want. And then simulate this. We can add more geometry just by pressing this little plus, and then what it will do is cycle through all of the input geometry, and we can change the weight to determine how much or how little of each one of these additional pieces of geometry that the paint stroke will choose. Finally, we can change some of the settings on the static object, but I found that leaving these as they are tends to work just fine. Cool. So that pretty much wraps up the Physics Painter tutorial, and next we'll look at Megascans objects and scene assembly in general.